Good afternoon and welcome to today's presentation, The Effect of Stormwater Runoff on Commercial and Private Properties. Before we begin our presentation today, I would like to take a few moments to go over some housekeeping items. We will be recording this webinar, and this webinar is CLE approved and will be asking that you enter a passcode for CLE credit a few times throughout the presentation. In today's webinar, Mr. Beyerlein will discuss the causes of flooding, rainfall runoff, how to measure precipitation, runoff, and stream flow, and hydrologic computer models. To give you a little background about our presenter, Doug Beyerlein, he has 30 years experience in water resource planning, flood studies, and storm management, and is senior hydrologic engineer and engineering group supervisor. He is a licensed registered engineer in Washington and California, and is a member of the American Resources Association and American Geophysical Union. For those of our attendees who require a code word for tracking purposes, the code word for today is water. During the presentation, we will take short breaks, and during that time, we will ask that you enter a passcode into the Q&A widget for CLE reporting purposes. This webinar is eligible for CLE credit in California, Illinois, Minnesota, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania. Please remember that if you are applying for CLE credit, you must log onto your computer as yourself. Also, please remember to complete the survey that will appear to the right of your screen at the end of the presentation. As a provider of CLE credits, we are required to have supportive information that you have attended, and in many states the survey is required. CLE certificates will be provided within 24 to 48 hours via email. CLE credit is only available for those who have attended the live presentation. CLE credit is only available. You are not eligible to receive CLE credit if you view this presentation on demand. Also, the PowerPoint slides can be downloaded from the resource list on the left of your screen. Mr. Beyerlein welcomes your questions. Please use the Q&A widget to the left of your screen to submit your questions throughout the presentation. We will take intermittent breaks so that Mr. Beyerlein can respond. Thank you again for attending today, and Doug, the presentation is now turned over to you.
Okay, well, thank you. Welcome, everyone. My name is Doug Beyerlein, and I'm a civil engineer who specializes in hydrology and stormwater management and all things wet. So with that said, let's get started. Also, I should tell you right up front that I'm not a lawyer, and while I've dealt with lawyers over the years, I only know enough water law to get myself in trouble. So I leave it to the lawyers to argue the legal side of things, and my goal is to provide lawyers with the sort of specific information, the quantitative information that can be used to clarify exactly what's going on out there in the real world and how to deal with stormwater issues. Okay, so if nothing else, I'd like you to remember from this presentation that the terms storms and floods are not the same. And we'll talk more about this as we get into this. But basically, people talk about, oh, we have a 100-year storm or we have a 100-year flood, and they can typically use those words interchangeably, and they shouldn't. So while we can have a 100-year storm, and not all large storms are 100-year storms, not all floods are 100-year floods either, and you can have the 100-year storm without having a corresponding 100-year flood, and I'll tell you why here as we go through this. Okay, so when it comes to water, basically what we're talking about is the interaction between the rainfall, precipitation, and the environment around it. So as you know, rain falls and lands on the ground, and then some of it runs off. And depending upon the soil conditions, the type of land use we have, what sort of conveyance systems we have, that governs basically how much water runs off how quickly. And I'll talk more about that also. And then typically we're interested in this only when we either have too much water and we've got flooding problems, or we have too little water and we have droughts. So depending upon where you are in the country, you are dealing with one or the other. In this part of the country, we've had unusually low amounts of rainfall over the winter period. I'm on the West Coast, and I know in other parts of the country that's not been the case. But either way, we can provide information as to what's going on and how to deal with it. So sometimes floods can be caused by things that happen upstream. For example, dam break, a dam failure. That can cause major problems downstream, as you can imagine. But also, sometimes we end up in situations where the flooding problem is caused by downstream constrictions to the channel. And so typically where we deal with floodplains, only a certain amount of development is allowed in the floodplain, and none typically is allowed in the floodway itself, with the idea that with that type of development, it constricts the flows, and then that in return causes upstream areas to have higher flood flows than they would otherwise. So it's basically like an hourglass. The constriction keeps the water from moving downstream at its normal rate. And so various jurisdictions have different rules about how much development can be allowed in the floodplain. And typically FEMA allows a 1-foot rise in the floodplain, 1-foot rise in the water surface level for the 100-year flood. But some jurisdictions have a 0 rise restriction, so that no increase in flood depths are allowed. And so we can model this and see exactly what's to expect. Now, we also have situations where we can have floods caused by saturated soils, and this produces landslides. And in Washington State here, we had a major landslide in March of last year. This was the Oso landslide, which is about 60 miles northeast of Seattle. And this caused, this was in a rural area, but there were still homes in the area, and it caused a total of 43 deaths. So it was a major event. This happened on actually a sunny day. It wasn't a rainy day, but it happened in March. It was March 20th of 2014, and it occurred at the end of a long rainy period. And so the question is of course, what happened and why? And so what we can see from some of these slides is that this is the location here. There's a red dot. I don't know if you can see it that well, but this is basically in western Washington, in the foothills of the Cascades. So this is an area that is fairly rural. There's logging going on, but there's also homes in the area, and this was in a valley where the North Fork of the Snohomish River flows, and the hillside above basically failed and slid down across the river, and the landslide itself traveled for about a mile, destroying everything in its path. And so this was a soil failure on a steep slope, and of course then the question is, why? What caused this? So currently there's in court, there's a lawsuit, civil lawsuit going on against the state, the county, and the private company that logged the land that was at the top of the slide. And so the lawsuit claims that the actions taken by those jurisdictions and the company basically led to the landslide and to the resulting damage to the property and also the deaths of the individuals that lived in the valley there. So, there's a number of issues here, and basically catastrophes like this don't happen just because of one thing. I generally have a rule of 3 where it takes typically 3 major things to occur all at the same time. So what we had here was a very steep slope in an area that gets heavy rainfall, and there have been a number of landslides in this valley over the last probably 10,000 years, ever since the glaciers carved out these valleys. And then the addition of allowing people to build in the valley and have homes there, such that when this landslide occurred and when the soil sloped down into the valley, destroying everything in their path, this is what caused the disaster. If this would have happened a mile or two to the east or to the west from where this occurred, it would have been an equally large slide, but there would not have been any homes in the way, and we probably wouldn't even be talking about this now. But so, some will argue, well, this was typical of what happens in these areas where we get unstable slopes and we have a lot of rainfall. And then others say, well, this has been made worse through the fact that at the top of the slope there was clear cutting that had occurred in the past. And so what that means is that because of the clear cutting, we now have less water going back when it rains, going back or being captured by the vegetation and going back to the atmosphere as evapotranspiration, and we have more water than running off, and in this case, infiltrating into the soils, and then that's saturating the soils and lubricating them, and then that increased the likelihood of a landslide. And so exactly how this is all going to be resolved remains to be seen. And so it will be some time before we actually know what the court decides on this fact. But, the question is, how much protection should the county and the state provide? And, in terms of how much limitation is there for people's use of their property. So it's an unresolved matter, but is going through the court system as we speak. And so, should we prevent people from building in these areas, or should we prevent logging on steep slopes? And there's some combination of solutions there, and I'm not sure exactly what it is. The county looked at what would be required if we did not allow building within a mile of any steep slopes, and in this particular county, that would basically remove about half of the land area from potential development. So that doesn't seem like that's going to probably happen. Now, there are other causes of flooding, and a lot of times these are caused by rain-on-snow events. This is an example here east of Seattle, where the Snoqualmie River floods agricultural valley, and this flooding occurs almost every year, so it's fairly regular. But this is typically caused by when we have a snowpack in the mountains, and then we get warm rain on it, and that then melts a lot of that snow and causes flooding. In smaller urban areas, typically we get it's more in terms of rainstorms on saturated ground, where it's just a matter of the fact that the area has a lot of impervious surfaces, and this then when we get a lot of rain and we have the saturated soils, basically the water has nowhere to go, and we get localized flooding as a result. But we don't necessarily get a 100-year flood every time we get a 100-year storm. And so we have to distinguish between the two. There's situations where if we get a very large storm event on dry soils, then those soils have the ability to absorb a lot of that water prior to having any runoff occur. Whereas if the soils are already saturated, then that water really has nowhere else to go. and that's oftentimes what causes the flooding. So you can actually get a situation where you have a 10-year storm that produces a 100-year flood because it may have occurred right after another big storm event that has basically filled up all the storage in the soil, and then the additional rainstorm just has the capacity of sending a lot of water down into the streams and people's yards and everywhere else. So you can get a situation that goes either way. This is an example here. This is the Snohomish River at Snohomish, Washington, where the river floods fairly regularly, but in this particular case, we had a 100-year storm, but it only caused about a 10-year flood. 10-year floods still can cause a lot of damage, but it's certainly not the biggest flood that's been seen out in that area. So it's important to distinguish between storm and floods. And then here's a situation where we had a few years ago a 100-year storm on the Chellis River. This is about between Seattle and Portland, about 100 miles south of Seattle. Interstate 5 was flooded and closed as a result of the flooding of the Chellis River. And so, in theory, the roadway was built to be high enough to be above the 100-year flood, but it doesn't mean that larger floods can't overtop the roadway itself, as you see in this case, and cause a flood. In this case, it's more in the range of a 200-year flood. So even though we have certain levels of protection, this doesn't mean necessarily that we're always protected from these large events. And so you can see in this situation, basically, there was just too much water everywhere, and this is the result. Now, this whole rainfall-runoff relationship can change depending upon how we go out and use the land. So, for example, as I mentioned before in the Oso landslide, one of the issues there was the clear-cutting of the trees at the top of the slope, and so changes in vegetation will change the amount of runoff. So, for example, with that Oso landslide area, I just did my own calculations just to get an idea of the sense of what the impact of the clear-cutting would be. And just using the computer models that I have at my disposal, I found that the increase in runoff caused by changing from a forested condition to a clear-cut condition increases the amount of runoff by about 5% in that example. And so that doesn't necessarily sound like a lot, but that was an additional 5% more water that then entered into the saturated hillside, which, depending upon other conditions, may have just been enough to have triggered the landslide. Or maybe it didn't make any difference at all. Maybe there was already enough water in there to trigger the landslide, and that's, of course, what the experts will have to resolve as they go through the lawsuit. And I'm sure that there'll be experts on both sides which will argue in both directions. But hopefully with more detailed technical analysis by the scientists and by using the computer models that we have available, we can get a better handle on exactly what the impact is when the vegetation changes in this situation. We can also get problems or increases in runoff just caused by changes in the soil itself, and this generally occurs through soil compaction by construction equipment. So, for example, if you have a soil out there which in its native environment has a lot of capacity for storage, and then you start running heavy equipment over it and basically flattening it and compressing it, you are removing a lot of that storage in the soil itself, so that when it does rain, instead of the water being able to infiltrate into the soil and be stored in the soil, at least temporarily before it slowly runs off. Now this soil starts acting more like an impervious surface and generates more runoff more quickly. And so this often happens in urban areas, in particular where we're going in and basically changing everything by reconfiguring the contouring of the land and producing flat areas where we can build, where we may have had hills and other features before that allowed us to control or handle that water better. And then there's situations where, of course, we just go out there and we just pave over everything. And so in those areas, of course, now we have a lot more water to deal with. So, for example, in the Puget Sound region around Seattle, typically we get about 40 inches of rainfall a year on average, which doesn't sound like that much, but it just rains all the time. And raining outside right now as I speak, not heavily, but just enough to get you wet. But the idea is that with that, we only get in a forested area about 20 inches of runoff, and about 20 inches, the other 20 inches then is going back to the atmosphere through evapotranspiration. Cut down all those trees and pave it over, and now when you have 40 inches of rainfall on average, you only get about 8 inches of evaporation from the impervious surfaces, and now you have 32 inches of runoff, so that now you have a lot more water to deal with. And so this is reflected then, of course, in the magnitude of the flooding that you get and the sort of stormwater mitigation features that you need to decrease the impact of that. So these are all things that we can quantify when we do computer modeling of this. And so we can then come up with solutions that limit the impact of these changes. We don't necessarily totally eliminate the impact, but at least we can minimize the potential for damage to public and private properties. So it's something that is important from that perspective. An example of this was another project that I worked on, which is also in the Puget Sound region. This is on Whidbey Island, which is in Puget Sound, and in this particular situation, there were a number of homes that had been built along the beachfront on top of a levee that had been constructed years ago. As such, being on top of the levee, these were above the typical areas that you might think of being flooded, but the problem being is that uphill or upstream development was generating more runoff into the farmland that was on the upstream side or the uphill side of the levees themselves. So the end result of this was now you had water traveling down through this farmland area and getting to the levee, backing up behind the levee, and then when it got high enough, it would overtop and basically overtop the levee itself and flood some of these homes. And so the question was who's responsible and what should we do about it? And so to try to answer that question, we basically looked at what was going on here and came up with a computer model to better represent exactly what was going on and how to deal with it. So in this situation, we have the upstream area, which was fairly large in size. Some of it was farmland, which has not really changed over the years, but further uphill there had been commercial and residential development, which was producing more runoff. And so as this runoff came down through the farmland, through man-made channels and the like, it was basically being stored in lagoons or ponds behind the levees and then being pumped from the uphill side, from the farmland, directly into the bay, so that it would not get too high on the uphill side and flood these houses along the levee road here. But with the new development, we had more water. So the question is how do we deal with that, and who's responsible? And so there was a lawsuit in this case trying to figure out basically who was going to be responsible and who was going to pay, and what was the solution. So we have all this water here that is now sitting in the farmland area, which the farm area wasn't really being used for farming at this point, but in any case, it was still water that needed to be dealt with. So what we did in this example here was to look at what sort of pumping was necessary to keep those floodwaters from getting too high and then causing the problems that we were seeing. And so in this situation, we basically had to look at, okay, what's the land use like, and what is the pumping that is going on now? When is this pumping inadequate? And then with future development on this uphill slope area, what sort of additional pump capacity do we need to make sure that the homes that are down along the shoreline there on the levee are not in danger of being flooded? So these are the type of issues that we can answer as engineers and provide the lawyers with the information necessary then to come up with a solution. So the solution then was a question of, working together with the upland owners and with the county in this case to basically pay for the expense of providing the sufficient pumping necessary to provide the protection that the downstream homeowners were looking for. So this is how we approached the problem and provided a solution. So these are the sorts of things that oftentimes come up, and these aren't the only ones, but these were just a couple of examples that I was most familiar with, so that it gives you a feel for kind of how the engineers look at it and try to basically quantify exactly what's going on. And that way then at least we can provide some numbers to people to make decisions with, rather than just trying to argue that, well, things are worse and how can we make them better. So this way at least we can provide some quantitative information related to that. So at this point, let's take a short break here and we'll see what questions we have, and then we'll proceed.
Okay, and could all the attendees please type the passcode into the Q&A? Our first question is, under the Clean Streams Law, if the plaintiff prevails, can the defendant be required to reimburse the plaintiff for plaintiff's counsel fees and costs?
Well, like I said, I am not a lawyer, so quite honestly, I don't know what the law is on a subject like that. That's outside of my area of expertise.
Okay, the next question is, in 1975, a landowner purchased property and began development. Under the dominant estate overburdening, plaintiffs must prove the pre-development runoff, including water elevations. How do you investigate and determine pre-development stormwater runoff?
Well, it's been my experience that that's dependent upon how the local jurisdiction defines pre-development. So, for example, in Washington State here, we have NPDES permits. And these permits, which are established by the Washington State Department of Ecology, specify that pre-development be defined as forested conditions. So in other words, prior to any local development. And so even if the land today has been logged and has been turned into rural residential or something like that, if you come in and you want to build a Walmart or some other development, you basically have to go back to that pre-developed forested condition and use that. Now, that's not necessarily true everywhere. We also do work in California, and in California they have regional water boards. Each regional water board sets their own permit requirements, and so some of them have the same sort of idea that you go back to basically prior to any land use change, what the original conditions were, and that is your pre-developed condition. And others say, no, it's existing, whatever is physically out there today, as what was prior to the proposed development, and that becomes a pre-existing condition. So it varies.
Okay, and how do level spreaders dissipate point source discharge?
Well, the whole idea behind level spreaders is basically that you're taking a concentrated flow and then you're allowing it to spread out or sheet flow over a larger area. And by doing this, then it has more opportunity for that water then to infiltrate into the soil itself. And also some of it will get caught on, let's say if you have lawn or grass area, will get caught on the vegetation. And so this gives it more opportunity to both infiltrate into the soil and also provide some additional evapotranspiration back to the atmosphere. So it's a way of basically decreasing the peak flow and also potentially decreasing some of the volume of runoff.
Okay, and this person says, my client owns a house on the west side of water runoff ditch or a creek that has an uncontrolled increase in water drainage from big box development upstream. What engineering data is needed to show that upstream runoff is unreasonably damaging to the downstream?
So what the sort of information that we typically need is we need to know, first of all, the historic rainfall for that particular location. What we like to see is a long-term record of rainfall so that we can see how it varies from time to time. And then, in addition, of course, what sort of land use is upstream, the size of it, how many acres we have, what sort of soils are there. We can specify the soils in terms of different types of soil groupings to get an idea of what their characteristics are, and then what the pre-development conveyance system look like. In other words, where did that water go when it ran off originally? Did it all get put into a pipe or a channel, or did it spread out over a larger area? And then how's that changed today? So we need to know the physical characteristics of what that looks like, and then the information related to the hydrology of the area.
Okay, those are all the questions we have for now. We do have some additional questions, but we'll be answering them in the second Q&A. So in about 27 minutes, we'll address those. So please continue, Doug.
Okay, well, thank you. Well, I look forward to any other questions you have, and in the meanwhile, let's talk about some of these other issues. So, as I mentioned, one of the things that we do is we try to quantify exactly what's going on out there in the real world. So, for example, this example that I talked about before the break here, we used a computer model to determine the runoff and then the needed pumping rates. And so to do this, we modeled the whole hydrologic cycle to do that. And so that then allows us to determine exactly where the water goes. And so we track with the computer model, we can track all the water all the time everywhere. And so let me give you a little bit more information about exactly how we do that. So typically, we do this to answer questions. And so this oftentimes occurs where we don't have any measured data at a particular location. In the real world, we generally don't have the data that we'd like that's already been collected. Sometimes on large rivers and urban streams, there are stream gauges out there, but oftentimes there are not. And even when we do have that data, it doesn't necessarily mean that it has the information for when we need it. There's an unfortunate rule of thumb when it comes to big floods is that they tend to wipe out the measuring stream gauges that are out there to measure how big they are. And so we have other ways of determining basically how big they are, but oftentimes, the best way is to have that measured data, but sometimes we just don't have it, and that's oftentimes the case. And then a lot of times when we're looking at situations where we want to know what's going on over a long period of time, even if there is collected data out there, it's just not for a long enough period of record. So, for example, if we want to do a flood frequency analysis, we'd like to have 50 years or more of data to use to do that sort of analysis. And if you only have a 10-year record of, for example, stream flow, that's just not long enough. So we need a long period of record to be able to statistically analyze what's going on out there in the real world. And then sometimes the measured data that we do have is just questionable. It's just something where we can oftentimes look at it and get a pretty good feel as to, is this good information or not? And because oftentimes it's collected in situations where it's hard to get a good measurement, the data has problems. It either has data gaps or the actual calculation of flow is questionable. So oftentimes we can check and come up with better information just by using our computer models to get a better understanding of what's going on out there. And then in particular, we're oftentimes asking what-if questions. What if this had not happened, or what if that changed, or what if they had done this instead? What would be the effect? And so oftentimes we use our computer models to answer those sort of questions. I'm working on a project right now for a client where basically it's the question of, well, what if we change the amount of upstream stormwater detention storage? How will that change the downstream flooding? And so we can do that sort of what-if analysis and basically provide then good guidance on how to proceed. So when we do the modeling and we look at the real world out there, we're looking at it in terms of certain types of parameters, and these are the typical ways that we look at it. So we talk about floods in terms of peak flows, and we use the units of cubic feet per second. So, for example, a big flood on the Mississippi River can be 2 million cubic feet per second. Now, you can also use units like gallons per minute. That's a flow rate also, but that's not the units that are typically used by hydrologists. So we usually work in cubic feet or in certain situations in acre feet. So when we talk about flows, we're talking about them in cubic feet per second, or CFS. When we talk about water depths or the water height or the stage is just another term for how deep the water is. We typically use feet for that. And then when we're talking about volumes of water in terms of how much water is being stored, for example, behind a reservoir or is being flooding a particular site, we talk about the flow volumes in acre feet of water. So 1 acre foot is an acre in size built to a depth of 1 foot. And you can convert that into millions of gallons if you like, but we use typically the units of acre feet for that. And then we talk about flood frequency and flow durations. And so Those are the types of information that we can statistically analyze when it comes to what's going on out there in the real world. And I'll talk a little bit more about those here in just a minute. So our goal is to basically determine what's going on over a range of conditions. So we look at peak flows, like I mentioned, and low flows both, and depending upon what sort of question we're trying to answer. But oftentimes when it comes to constructing computer models, even if we're only interested in looking at peak flows, we want to make sure that our models can represent the entire range of the hydrology that we see out there. So we want to make sure that we're accurately representing what's going on both during the floods and during the low flows to be able to demonstrate that we are accurately modeling the entire hydrologic cycle over all the range of flows that occur out there in the real world. So when we talk about flood frequency, typically we're talking about floods that are in the range between the 2-year flood up to the 100-year flood. Now, they can be bigger floods and there can be smaller floods, but those are the general range that we oftentimes are analyzing for. And so it's a good idea to get a better understanding of exactly what we mean when we talk about those. So when we talk about floods, a 100-year flood has a 1% chance of occurring in any one year. And we talk about it in terms of water years. So a calendar year starts January 1 and goes through December 31st, but a water year starts October 1 and goes through September 30th. And the reason for the difference is that we don't want to do our analysis based upon what's going on typically in the wet season, which is oftentimes in the wintertime. So we start by looking at what's going on at the driest period, and when we look at stream flows, the flows are typically the lowest right around the end of summer. And so September, October, when the flows are low, and then oftentimes we'll have our floods occurring during December, January, and so on. And whether it occurs in December or January, basically it's all in the same water year. So that's the reason why we use a water year instead of a calendar year. But the idea being that if you have protection against a 100-year flood, doesn't mean that it's never going to flood for your particular site. It just means that in any one single year, you only have a 1% chance of that type of flood occurring. Now, you can have a smaller flood occur. For example, a 10-year flood has a 10% chance of occurring in any one year, and a 2-year flood has a 50% chance of occurring in any single year. And there's no such thing as a 1-year flood. And the reason why there isn't is because statistically that would mean a 1-year flood would mean that it had a 100% chance of occurring in any single year, and you never have a 100% chance of anything occurring. Now, you can have very close to that. You can have a 99.99% chance of a flood occurring or a flow occurring, and that would be, for example, a 1.001 year flood. Very close to a 1 year, but not exactly the same. So from a hydrology point of view, it makes a difference. Now, from a if you're looking at storms, it is possible to have a 1-year storm or even a 6-month storm, but that does not readily compute into flood frequency. So there is a major difference there. And it's also possible to have 2 100-year floods occurring in 2 years, 1 year right after the other. Very rare, it's less than a 1% chance, but just because you have a 100-year flood doesn't mean that you get to have 99 years of flood-free worry until your next flood comes along. It doesn't work that way. So oftentimes people get upset when they get 2 major floods occurring in 2 years, and that's understandable, but it can happen. So oftentimes what we see, though, is that particularly for small urban streams, that the flooding is occurring more often than it used to in the past. And this is just an example. This happens to be close to where I live in the Seattle metropolitan area, and where prior to development in this particular watershed, the 100-year flood was about 200 cubic feet per second. And so, that's what people kind of expected to occur very rarely. But with development occurring, with changes in land use, what happens now is that size of an event occurs much more often. And instead of being a 100-year flood, now 200 cubic feet per second now is a 10-year flood. And so we're seeing these events occur more regularly than we did in the past, and causing more damage as a result. And so obviously then the local jurisdictions are trying to figure out ways to mitigate the impacts of this runoff occurring from the new development so as to minimize these large events, but we're not totally successful. And part of the reason for that is because when we look at these events, oftentimes what we're sizing them is based upon flood frequency, but we forget about flow duration. And flow duration is a percent of time that a flow is exceeded. So, for example, if you're in a location where you get a 100-year flood, but it only lasts for 1 hour, you may be able to deal with that for that 1 hour. But if you have a flow duration where that flood now occurs, instead of for 1 hour, it occurs for 1 week or 1 month, even though the maximum flow rate may not be any higher than it was during the 1 hour flood, the fact that it's occurring for a longer period of time means that it's going to cause more damage. And so now what we're doing oftentimes is designing the flood mitigation facilities to not only keep the flood peaks from increasing, it's also keeping the flow durations from increasing. And so that can then be used to help minimize additional damage, erosive damage in particular. So that in some jurisdictions, for example, in Washington State here, the sizing of stormwater mitigation facilities is required to demonstrate that we're not increasing flow durations. So some regulations in some parts of the country are taking that into account, but it's not true everywhere. So one of the things that we use our computer models for is to determine the information that's necessary for flood insurance studies. And so I've done a number of these studies for FEMA. And so we use our models to basically determine what area is going to be flooded in terms of what's in the floodplain. The floodplain generally is defined as what is flooded by the 100-year flood. And then we look at also the flood depths. And so this oftentimes then correlates to what sort of insurance rates are going to be required. So these studies obviously have been done throughout the country, and FEMA updates them as necessary and is available. So we can use our models also for doing things like looking at water quality pollution problems with total maximum daily loads. This is a study area for the Chesapeake Bay area where there's been problems with pollution in the Chesapeake Bay. We can look at the models to determine the allocation of water based upon water rights, and this is in California, and basically who has how much water available. And of course, this is a major issue today, so it's something that is being looked at in detail. And we can look at things as they relate to fish migration, so places where we have culverts, for example, on the left-hand side there, where it's too high for the fish to get into the culvert, we can use our computer models to basically come up with designs that make our culverts and streams more fish-friendly. And then we're doing things to basically demonstrate compliance with the Clean Water Act, and a lot of what I've talked about is related to that. So this requires basically meeting the NPDES permit requirements for Phase 1 and Phase 2 communities. These are generally in major urban areas, and they vary from state to state. But basically what we're looking at is how to control the runoff from new development and provide all the types of requirements specified in the Clean Water Act. So there are specific documents for this. This is for Washington State, for example, where I do a lot of my work, put out by the Washington State Department of Ecology. And then to kind of sum it up, basically we have a number of different ways we can do this. We use in different parts of the country either single event methods, which is an old methodology, or what we call continuous simulation, which is what we're typically using now with our more advanced computer models. So the single event approach was designed for slide rules back in the day when we didn't have computers, and so we had to make a lot of assumptions. And so these things aren't necessarily things that you need to know about, but if you're hiring an expert, they should be things that they know about so that they understand the limitations that go into these assumptions and why oftentimes these single event methods in particular do not give very accurate information that then it gets reflected in the sizing, the design of stormwater facilities, and why oftentimes they do not work as expected. Continuous simulation, however, overcomes a lot of these obstacles because they look at a whole range of conditions. And so this is more accurate, and this is where we look at how the water moves through the entire hydrologic cycle. So there's a couple of key ways or softwares that are available out there that have been developed for the Department EPA, and the two main ones are HSPF and the other one is SWIM. And so they both have their pluses and minuses. HSPF does a better job of the rainfall-runoff calculations. SWIM does a better job of doing the routing through pipe systems, for example. So, and depending upon what we're trying to do, we can combine the two to generate the most accurate information possible. So we use this oftentimes to determine what sort of mitigation are necessary when we go from a pre-developed to a post-developed condition, figure out where we can then provide the necessary mitigation. So we can do this in a number of different ways. This is a stormwater pond or basin, for example, where water can be stored and then released at a lower rate to mimic what was going on in the pre-developed case. We can also use things like underground vaults where we can store the water temporarily and then release it at a slower rate. Or things like tanks or pipes. These are 6-foot diameter corrugated metal pipes that were placed under a Costco in the Seattle area. And so we basically had to determine how much storage was necessary, how many feet of pipe they needed to meet the requirements there. And then we also have other solutions, things like gravel trenches, where we can basically pour the water into the gravel and then it seeps through down to the bottom and then can either be collected and discharged or it can go infiltrate into the native soil underneath. So we have a number of ways that we can deal with this. Another recent mitigation measure that we have been using a lot more of is permeable or porous pavement, where the water, instead of immediately running off the pavement, goes through the pavement itself and gets stored in a gravel sublayer underneath the pavement, and then this then gives the water a chance to infiltrate into the native soil underneath the pavement, or it can be collected through an underdrain and then routed to some sort of other necessary mitigation, but it reduces the speed and volume at which water runs off of what we typically consider, paved surfaces. Also, things like bioretention or rain gardens are being used a lot to collect water and then allowing it to go through a soil mix in the ground, and this provides water quality treatment. And then once again, you can have the water collected underneath, and some of it can go either into the native soil or it can go to some downstream conveyance system. Also, things like planter boxes, where these things can be placed right next to buildings, collecting the roof runoff, for example, or sidewalk runoff, and then allows the water to go through this soil layer down into a gravel storage layer and then can be discharged. So these are all different solutions that can be used in different places for different purposes. And even things like green roofs. This is a green roof in Portland, Oregon, which has been used to understand basically how green roofs function, and they collected the runoff from this to get an idea of what sort of reduction you get. And typically for green roofs, you can get about a 20% to 30% reduction in total runoff volume with a green roof. And it varies, of course, depending upon climatic conditions and basically how much soil you have and vegetation on the roof itself. So these are all sorts of things that can be used to deal with the types of problems that we see out there today. But in summary, basically, I just want you to remember once again that the flood frequency is not the same as storm frequency. You should not use those words interchangeably. Flood and storm are different. And that we can use things like continuous simulation models to accurately represent what's going on out there in the real world and answer the sort of what-if questions that oftentimes occur that people want answers to. And the older single-event methods that were developed back in the days of the slide rule really are not the way to answer these questions, because oftentimes they can't provide us with the necessary details that we need to better understand exactly what's going out there in the real world. So,
okay, Doug, we're going to have to move on to the Q&A just to make sure we get some of the questions answered.
That's fine.
Okay, and our first question is, are there models for showing the effects of a 100-year storm in different parts of the country?
And the quick answer is yes. Yeah, and obviously it varies depending upon the rainfall in that part of the country and the soil characteristics.
Okay, and could you all please type the passcode into the Q&A? And our next question is, you talked about floodplains earlier. Which government entity is ultimately responsible for preparing or proposing a flood plan? Is it the municipality, county, state, or federal government?
Well, typically it falls on the counties. So oftentimes they're the ones who basically are implementing FEMA policies.
Okay, and can installation of flood doors and or building boots help to protect commercial properties from getting flooded during a 100-year storm for a building? If yes, what other types of protection can be used to prevent flooding in a commercial building?
Well, you can certainly use anything that keeps the water out. So in other words, constructing a levee wall or dike around the building is another solution. If possible, raising the building is probably a better solution, but oftentimes that's not practical. But there's, some limitations there, obviously.
Okay, this is going to have to be our last question. We will be able to get the questions answered for you if we didn't get to your question. So the last question is, can a homeowner of an existing property successfully sue a developer of new homes if the surface water flowing downhill from a new development is flowing onto and damaging the existing homeowner's property?
Well, there's no easy answer to that, but basically, yes, if you can show neglect or negligence by the upstream property owner in terms of how they went about designing and constructing that facility.
Okay, thank you for answering our questions.
Thank you.
Okay, and in addition to being your best source for testifying and consulting experts, TASA also offers e-discovery and document management solutions, free interactive webinars, and research reports on expert witnesses, such as the Challenge History Report 2.0, the Professional Sanction Search, and Expert Profile 360. I want to take this opportunity to thank everyone for attending, and most especially Doug Beyerlein for his time and effort in creating this presentation. If you would like to speak with Mr. Beyerlein, or if you would like to speak with a TASA representative regarding an expert witness for a case that you are working on, please contact TASA at 1-800-523-2319. This is a reminder that we will be sending out a link to you tomorrow with the archive recording. The archive recording will also be posted in the Knowledge Center on TASA's website. If you have any questions or comments, please email Carol Kowaleski. Thank you all again for attending, and have a great day, everyone.